And what I want to do now is introduce Randall Akee, who is the chair of the American Indian Studies Interdepartmental Program and an associate professor of public policy at UCLA. He is also the author of one of my favorite papers ever on the Smoky Mountain study and the casino distributions. So I've been a tremendous fan of his work for a long time, and I'm excited to hear the paper that he'll be sharing with us today. So I believe, Randall, you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
So thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me, and great being here. The other thing I'll just say, too, is that I think, there might be clarifying questions that might be helpful along the way. So please do jump in, Catherine, if you can, if people ask questions, because the data set is non-standard, and so there may be questions that would, not fundamental. Well, anyway.
Questions of clarification, if anyone wants to type those right into the Q&A,
because
I
assume that'll be helpful. Yeah,
okay.
I assume.
Absolutely.
Okay. So thanks again for having me. I appreciate it. So I'm Randy Akee, and this is joint work with Maggie Jones, who I think is going to be presenting some other joint work of ours at some point in the future.
She will be.
Seminar.
Yep, she will.
Yeah. And so what we're going to be looking at is immigrants' earnings growth and return migration from the U.S., examining determinants using linked survey administrative data. And Maggie is a Census Bureau employee, and anything here, are our own personal views and not that of the Census Bureau. And everything we have has been cleared by the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board, and everything has been reviewed to ensure that no confidential information is disclosed, and there's some rounding you'll see in some of our tables as a result of that. So I will just sort of give you the briefest overview of immigration research. One of the biggest questions that we in the literature is, what's the average quality of immigrants to the U.S. And then once they get here, how do immigrants fare in the U.S.? Do they assimilate to that of native born? And the real crux of the question is, are they a benefit or are they a drag on the economy? That's where the policy aspects and the political aspects come into play. And that, as I say here in 2.3, informs the academic and discussion on immigration. The other aspect that we also care about is, what's the impact on how does labor market success impact return migration decisions? Is it due to observable or unobservable characteristics of the immigrants themselves? Are there time invariant or variant characteristics that may play a role in the dynamic decision to return? And ultimately, one problem that has plagued this research is data availability. And I'll show you how we think we've overcome some of this in our setting. And so there's a lot of previous work on this, and I can't do it justice in the time that we have, but just broadly speaking, the sort of first generation of economic analysis on this was done by Barry Chiswick, and there he looked at, just a single cross-section of census data, and we learned very sort of concisely that immigrants have fairly high rates of earnings growth the longer they stay in the U.S. Borjas, in subsequent analysis, pointed out a potential flaw in that methodology, in that a single cross-section conflates arrival cohorts with earnings growth over decades, and so employed repeated cross-sections and found immigrants have slower growth, earnings growths over time. And then subsequent analysis on stock-based panels, so panels where all immigrants had survived or remained in the U.S. up until a particular year, like 1995, and then we looked at all of their earnings over time, sort of backward-looking, by research by Lubotsky and Duleep and Regis, actually showed somewhat slightly more optimistic results in terms of earnings growth than the Borjas analysis. And then more recently, there's been some complete panel analysis by Abramitsky and Bustan using historical census data, some work on a very narrow slice of just people with PhDs. Borjas has done some work, and then most recently, Rowe and Sanders using the LEHD and census data have looked at more recent arrivals. And we can talk a little bit about how their work differs from our work, primarily because they're looking at a population that has been in the US for at least 5 years, and we're going to be looking at a population of immigrants that have just newly arrived within the current year or the year prior. And I'll talk to you about that as we go on. So yeah, as I said, our contributions to this research is that we've put together a relatively novel panel data set where we can look at an entire immigrant cohort over approximately a decade in the United States. And because of that, because it's a true panel, we can identify return migrants. And because we have the characteristics of the immigrants, primarily from the American Community Survey or census data, we can look at the impact of we can look at the impact of initial characteristics of the immigrants on their return migration decisions, as well as their earnings assimilation or earnings growth over time. And we can also look at earnings in every year prior to their return, which we think is a pretty novel outcome here as well. So for instance, we are going to look at individuals who say they arrived in the US in the year 2005, as indicated from the American Community Survey, which asks, what year did you arrive in the US? And we'll be able to link them to merged IRS data that is annual for every year from 2005 until 2015. And that's essentially the way in which we'll be creating this panel data set. Oops. Sorry. So we're going to really, and in this talk, I'm going to focus on two items. The characteristics of the return migrants. So I'll show you some different return migration rates by education, by gender, by country of origin. And then the other outcomes that I'll show you are the earnings of immigrants relative to the native born. And again, along certain characteristics. So next I'll talk to you about the data, because again, this kind of really matters here in terms of how we put this together and what this allows, what benefit putting this type of data set together gives us in this particular literature. And then I'll go on to talk about how we identify return migrants in our data set, how we define them and how we capture them or able to identify who they are. Then we'll look at the earnings assimilation. And at the very end, I'll talk to you about, it's actually a separate paper, but I thought the results are, I'll just show you two slides that look at immigrants who come to the US for graduate school, as opposed to immigrants who come to the US with graduate degrees and how that differs. So it's actually a smaller side paper, but I'll just show you some of the results because I think they're in line with the rest of the paper, but and I think they're quite interesting. So the data that we look at focuses on three cohorts: the American Community Survey for the years 2005, 2006, and 2007. The American Community Survey is sort of the intercensal survey of the characteristics of the population. It replaced the census long form that used to be collected every decade. It gets somewhere between 2 to 3% of all households in the US population per year. And it really gives us the characteristics of the population. And how we use this data is that we look at year of entry. Again, we take people who in 2005 say they arrived in 2005 or the previous year. For the 2006 ACS, we again classify a new entrant, a new immigrant, as someone who says they arrived in the year 2006 or the previous year. Anyone who arrived in earlier years, we aren't considering a new immigrant to the US. We're only restricting our ages to 25 to 45. primarily because we want to be able to age people out and over 10 years. So we don't want people who are potentially entering into retirement age in this age group. And we're also trying to take people who are above the standard college ages. So 25 to 45 is our group. As I said, we're going to, in the first half of the paper, the first 90% of the paper, exclude people who are enrolled in college or graduate school. And the graduate school stuff, I'll show you the results later. And then what we do is we take those observations of new immigrants to the US in 2005, 6, and 7, and we link them at the census behind the census confidentiality and firewalls to W-2 and 1099 forms from the IRS for the years 2005 to 2015. So it creates the panel aspect of this data. And what we have is a nationally representative panel of immigrants who arrived in 04 to 07, essentially, that, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, that are, in the formal labor force. And I'll talk about this so it's nationally representative of the formal labor force immigrants. So how do we do this? Well, the US Census Bureau uses a protected identification key, a PIC, which is based on a grouping of characteristics: name, birth date, social security number, or ITIN, address, and other identifying information that exists primarily in administrative records. So it's a probabilistic match, and it tries to use the maximum all of these pieces of information to identify people. So that necessarily implies, as I was trying to allude to a little bit earlier, that integration into administrative records greatly improves the ability to link data. And that would imply several things. One is that the data that we are going to be looking at are heavily drawn from the documented immigrant flow to the US. Also, it's going to necessarily, again, be centered on those who are employed in the formal sector. So not those who are in the informal sector where they are not on Social Security records or W-2s or 1099s, etc. So those people are necessarily going to be not included in our data. So this table shows you that fact kind of explicitly. If you look at the first column here, this is just for men in ages 25 to 45. We have about 13,000 observations of men who meet all these requirements, arriving again in essentially 2004 to 2007, sort of new immigrants who are ages 25 to 45. And then we try to find how many of them have these PIC, these unique identifiers, can be found in administrative records. It's about 6,800, or only about 52%. So what this tells you is that 48% of the data of the observations are either individuals who are undocumented or out of the formal labor force, or both. And then finally, of the 6,800, we try to find the proportion of those that have any W-2s or 1099s in the data from 05 to 07. And of that amount, we get about 85%, or 5,800. And so this will be our final sample for men, and we'll follow that 5,800 over the next 10 years. And then here on the right is a similar count for women. So we have about 12,000 women, about 6,700 have a PIC, are not missing a PIC, and about 4,500 of that amount are found in the W-2s. Questions on this? Clear so far? Great. Okay. So just to show you again, to reinforce the fact that the matched group of data, this is just for men, are more likely to come from the formal labor sector and documented immigrant flows. I'll show you the difference in means for the matched versus the unmatched groupings in terms of the pick. So wages or salary income from the matched is about 40,000. From the unmatched, about 16,000. And to be clear, this is information that doesn't come from the W-2 or 1099s, because clearly we don't have those measures for the unmatched. This comes from the American Community Survey. So we find that they have higher earnings or salaries on average. They're about the same age, but the matched group is about 13 percentage points more likely to be married. Again, what you'd expect from sort of documentation purposes. The matched are less likely to be a high school graduate and more likely to be instead a college graduate, right? About 30% as opposed to 10% here. They're less likely to come from Mexico. They are more likely to come from India, about 15% versus about 3% in the unmatched. They're more likely to come from the Philippines and be matched, and more likely to come from China than the unmatched group. Okay. So now I'm going to talk to you about how we categorize what we call return migrants, or people who sort of leave the US. So we have information for when a person arrives in the US. So let's take the very first cohort of 2005, and we can do the same. We do the same sort of calculation for those who arrive in 2006 and who arrive in 2007. But let's just look at a single year for now. So if someone says they arrive in 2005, and we find a W-2 for them in 2005, and a W-2 for them only in 2005, and never again in subsequent years, so not in 2006, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to 2015, then we consider that person a one year, staying only 1 year in the US. If we find someone with a W-2 in 2005, and then again in 2006, and never again in subsequent years, so it's not as if they took time off and went back to school or went out of the labor market, went into the informal labor force, and then came back. We consider that person a 2 years in the US before immigration. Similarly, we do the same for 05 to 07, 05 to 08, 05 to 09, and we categorize a person as being a 1 year in the US, 2 years, all the way up to 10 years. I don't show it here, but we have been able to, because in 2010 there was a US Census, we were able to link the cohorts that, again, we said, well, we believed had left the US in these prior years. And what we find is that only 4% of these individuals that are missing actually are in the US by 2010. So it was an additional way of verifying our rationale that if you had a W-2 and then you never have a W-2 subsequently, it's a pretty fair indication that you've returned to some other country, maybe not necessarily your home country, but you're not in the US. And for at least up until 2010, for people who have left up until 2010, we have some pretty good validation of that fact. For the later years, presumably we could do that if and when the 2020 census becomes available.
Randy, can I jump in with
a
clarifying question of my own?
Sure.
So what do we know about, and because I know nothing about, error in tax filing and people that are like there 1 year, not there the next year, there the year after? Like, do people just take 1 year off and not file? Or I'm just curious, like, this sounds very neat and clean, but I can't imagine it's that neat and clean. I would imagine people bounce in and out of tax records more than maybe this shows. No?
Sure. So these are W-2s and these are 1099s from the employer's side. So this is from the employer side. And so the other
You're right. That's right.
concern would be that, well, people bounce into informal labor market and they're still in the US. Right. And that's why we try to verify by using the 2010 census to show that it turns out there's some people who are still in the US, not in the formal labor market, but not that many, especially not at this age, and not if you've already worked in the formal labor market, right? It's not as frequent that you go into informal.
Okay. And recession
Yeah, well, that's
Okay.
yes, yes, it's a problem. But the thing is, we're holding that constant over all of these people. I'll show you coming up.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
I will
yeah, no,
mute
it's a great
myself
question.
again.
No problem. I appreciate it. So we call someone a return migrant, who is someone who leaves at any point, and we don't have W-2s or 1099s in consecutive years. So again, this does allow for someone who, as I said earlier, you have a W-2 and you worked in 2005, but you left the labor force in 2006 and you come back in 2007, 8, 9, 10, all the way up, 9, 10, all the way up to 15, right? So we do allow for, sort of an unemployment spell, as long as there's no, consecutive years up until 2015. That's the year we truncate and we say, well, this person was only here until that point. So that's the group of return migrants. There's also a group that stays in the US continuously from the time of arrival, whether it's 2005, 2006, or 2007 until 2010. And that group, we're just labeling the panel group. They're the always stayers. And then when you add those two, the return migrants and the panel group together, you get what we typically have in research, which is the repeated cross-section. So we're going to be able to show some differences between these three groups in terms of their earnings assimilation and in terms of their earnings assimilation. But just having that in the back of your heads, I think, is useful. That, again, the return migrants are the ones that I've just tried to define. Those that don't have that are missing consecutive W-2s or 1099s at some point in our data set. And the panel group are the individuals who remain in the US and have continuous W-2s or 1099s over all these years. So the first set of results I'll show you is just return migration. We have essentially a sample of all migrants, again, in the formal labor force, in the documented flow. And we can show you the drop-off or the reduction in that pool, that arrival cohort, across the 10 years that we have. And we can interact that group by various characteristics, at least initial characteristics: educational attainment, country of birth, English language ability, and occupation, for instance, as well as gender. So this is the first slide. And so essentially what we're looking at is the presence of a W-2 or 1099 for males ages 25 to 45. And so across the y-axis, we have years, 2005 until 2015. And we have the red line here is the immigrant arrival cohort of the year 2005. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of that cohort. So in 2005, the red line says that as by definition, the arrival cohort is 100%. 1 year later, what we find is that the cohort has diminished by about 20%. Only about 80% of that immigrant arrival cohort is in the US anymore. We don't have evidence of them having a W-2 or 1099 for any of these subsequent years. And so that's the group that, so 80% remain after 1 year. If we look at the 2006 arrival cohort, again, that's this part right here, in their arrival year, they're 100%. A year later, they have a similar drop, about 20% as well. And we find similar results, although a little less intense of a drop for the 07 cohort. It's about, maybe 15% instead of 20%. For comparison, here I'm showing the native-born labor force participation rates. So I've normalized it to be 1 in 2005. And you see it's gone up and it's gone down. This is the Great Recession, as Catherine was asking about. It went down and then it went back up and actually overshot what it was in 2005, and it's been going on. Just to show you that there isn't something similarly going on other than with regard to the Great Recession for native-born labor force participation, for example. And let's see, I'll show you. This is extending the analysis to further cohorts, arrival cohorts over time. So originally I just showed you these 3 arrival cohorts. And so what appears to be sort of a resounding fact or a pretty robust fact, is that in the first couple of years of after arrival, for all immigrant cohorts, there's a relatively big drop in the cohort, something between 15 to 20% return migrate, or we have no evidence of them being employed in the formal labor market in the subsequent years. What is interesting about the Great Recession is that that drop starts to level out a bit. It becomes less likely that people are going to, a lower proportion of the arrival cohorts leave. As you see here, this 2010, which is sort of the height of the recession, the proportion that leave after 2 years is, about 12% or so. And that's in contrast to earlier years. So maybe it means things are bad everywhere and people are less likely to return back, perhaps. For the rest of our analysis, we'll only be looking at these three cohorts just because it gives more years to play out. But I wanted to show this result, just that there's at least some empirical regularity that within the first couple of years of arrival, there's relatively large drop-offs, right? It's not just a couple of percentage points. It ranges somewhere between 12 and 10% per year, even in the heights of the Great Recession. So this is the same results for women, aged 25 to 45. You see again, there's stark drop-offs in the first few years. And I didn't really point this out in the last slide, but it seems like there's this there's this threshold below which, after 10 years, no groups go below, somewhere between 60 and 70%. So the robust cohort of individuals, at least again in the formal labor force, settles out to be around 60 to 70%. And for men, I'll just go back one slide. It's about the same. It's actually a little bit lower. It's almost consistently at 60%. So it means that a slightly larger proportion of men return home than women on average. And then this is the same, all cohorts, all arrival cohorts for women. And again, you see there's a slight flattening of the return, although not nearly as much of a flattening as it was for men. Okay. So this slide just looks at a single entry cohort, the 2005 cohort, and decomposes it by educational attainment. So this is essentially the very first line on the very first slide that I showed you. And again, just disaggregating it by educational attainment as indicated on the American Community Survey. So again, remember, we're looking at men ages 25 to 45, and we also know the American Community Survey asks you whether you're currently enrolled in college or graduate school. And so we've necessarily excluded those people. So we shouldn't anticipate these individuals going back to school, but maybe they do. So again, take that with a grain of salt that this is at arrival. And what we find is that individuals that come to the US with the highest levels of education, in this case, this solid black line of an MA or PhD, are the most likely to return. Those that are the least likely to return, and it's mostly in a monotonic relationship here, are the next level is those with only a college degree, then those with a high school degree. The less than high school degree is, there are very few people that have that, so it's kind of a much more noisy estimate. And then some college is the, sort of above the individuals who remain, who are the highest probability of remaining in the US. So you can see that there's some variation in who return migrates. And the evidence appears to be that those with relatively higher education return migrate. I'll show you the results for women. That seems to be even more starkly the case that women who come to the US with a MA or PhD are vastly more likely than their less educated counterparts to return home. So I don't have explicit stories on why this is the case, and that's not sort of the purpose of the paper right now, but it's just to sort of document these differences. But again, I'm happy to talk about that if as we go along in the question and answer section. And then, so country of birth, again, sort of this is just the same cohort of 2005 men, and disaggregating by the top 5 countries that are immigrant sending countries to the US. And we find that the country that has the lowest amount of return are immigrants from the Philippines. So it's pretty solid upper bound at about 80%. The highest return is from return rates are to Canada and China, and India and Mexico are between. So again, lots of variation across these countries.
And Randy, Jeff Smith would like to know whether you think the more highly educated PhD types are like visiting faculty members who are coming for a conference or a talk, or some short gig in the US to do an academic-like thing. I believe that was the spirit of his question.
Interesting.
And I guess getting paid for it, right? Because they have.
yeah. But they have to have it for multiple years. Interesting. We do have industry, and we could try to exclude like education. That's interesting. If that would, it would at least take it off by, you know, right. You would expect if somebody came and got a 1099 for working for a summer, for instance, or something like that.
Yeah, he suggests consulting that generates a 1099.
Yeah.
Good question, Jeff.
So maybe we could exclude them from our analysis and see what it looks like. That's interesting. Cool. Okay. So country of birth, and then let me show you again for women. For women, the return migrants are the highest probability are from Canada, and again, women from the Philippines have slightly lower likelihood of returning. And so I'll just summarize these results. I haven't shown you all of them. They're in the paper, but we find high rates of return in the first 2 years. We find the highly educated are the most likely to return, migrate. There are differences across countries, as I've shown you. I didn't show you the results, but English language ability, because there's a question on that in the census, the ACS doesn't appear to have a strong determinant. It's not a strong determinant of return migration, and neither is marital status, actually, which also is kind of surprising. It doesn't differ significantly. Okay, next. So next I'll show you some evidence of earnings assimilation by the panel and return migrant subgroups of immigrants. So to compute this, essentially we run a regression of earnings on the left-hand side, the log of annual earnings for a person, on whether or not that person's an immigrant. And we have an age fixed effect for that person, as well as a state of residence fixed effect. And we do that for every year. And so what I'm going to show you is essentially a plotting of the beta coefficient, sort of the difference between earnings of an immigrant and a non-immigrant in every single year. So I'm going to have the beta for 2005, 2006, 7, all the way up to 2015. And what this is going to tell us is, well, what's the difference in an immigrant's earnings relative to that of the native born? And what you'll see is that immigrants earn less, at least in the initial years, and they have a convergence to that of the native born. And that'll be the first figure I show you, and then the subsequent figures, I'll interact immigrant by some of these initial characteristics like education attainment, race, country of birth, just to show how that differs across these groups. So again, across the y-axis, we have years from 2005 to 2015. Across the y-axis, we have the estimated coefficient of the beta. Sort of, again, a 0, which is this red dotted line, would imply that immigrants have no discernible difference, no statistical significant difference in earnings relative to their native counterparts, which in this case would be men ages 25 to 45. So the first line that I'll call your attention to is the black solid line, which is the panel all years. So this is the population that I mentioned earlier that are in the US consecutively and consistently over the entire time period. They're individuals for whom we're able to find W-2 or 1099s in all of these years. And what do we find? Well, we find that they start off at a deficit relative to the native born in the first year. And, you can have lots of explanations for that, why that is. Maybe they came in June of the first year, and so, of course, they're going to make less because they've only been working for 6 months. Or maybe they came in December. So on average, they're going to be making relatively lower amounts. That's perfectly fine. By year 2, we see that there's catch-up. By year 3, there's even greater earnings gain. By year 4, for this group, again, the panel group, they've essentially achieved earnings assimilation, that of the native born. There's even some slight, movement above. And it sort of persists at or above that of the native born. So that's the first group. The second group are the attritors, or those who at some point, right, whether after year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, disappear from our W-2 and 1099 panel data. And those are the people, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones we call return migrants, because we can't find them again subsequently in the administrative data, and also in the 2010 census for at least the first few years. What we find there is that their earnings at the outset are approximately, and I've tested these aren't statistically significantly different. So the group that decides to return home from the group that decides to stay in the US over all 15 years, at the outset are observationally equivalent to one another with regard to earnings. They still are at a deficit relative to native born, but they start off approximately earning the same amount of earnings. And actually, this group is earning slightly more, actually. It's not different. What we find, and what I think is novel here, is that for the attritors, there's a downward earnings trajectory. So that there's a point at which earnings continually fall in every year. And that is something that the literature did not identify in previous research. And it couldn't identify this because there wasn't a panel data set that allowed for the creation of the earnings of return migrants, just by virtue of the fact of the inability of the data sets, whether they were stock data sets or repeated cross sections. And so this, I think, is a novel finding here, that the return migrants essentially experience downward earnings trajectory. And that might be, and that's what we posit in the paper, is an important determinant of return migration. Essentially, you have a bad outcome in the US labor market. You migrate, you observationally, again, at the outset, look pretty much like the successful immigrants, the long-term stayers, but something happens and you are on a downward path, and that is an important determinant of whether or not you stay in the US. So that's what we think is going on here. And I'll show you some more results for women as well coming up. And let me just complete this by showing the dotted black line, which is just the combination of the two, which is the repeated cross section. So if you add these two, the average results look like this. And that's, again, this dotted line is essentially what we would see if we didn't have panel data. We would see repeated cross-section of 06, 07, 08 using the American Community Survey, for instance. And what that tells us is that repeated cross-section would tell us that assimilation or earnings assimilation happened in 2012, it tells us that earnings assimilation takes a longer period of time for immigrants than it does in reality for those who stay the whole time. So, the downward earnings trajectory brings the average assimilation rate for immigrants, lengthens it. And again, I think this is an insight that I don't think we knew in this literature because of the limitations of data. Okay, and now I'll show you the same results, disaggregating the red line. So again, let me just go back one slide and show you this slide again. So this red line here is the sum of all of those immigrants who return migrate. And here's that same red line disaggregated into a 10-year, someone who stays in the US for 10 years, or immigrants who stay for 10 years, those who stay for 9, 8, etc. And again, this is, I think, useful because the aggregate version of this shows a downward earnings trajectory, but so do the individual cohorts. And again, I sort of want to draw your attention to, the last year of each of these is, much lower than the previous year. And again, a response would be, well, again, if somebody left in 2011, it's not necessarily the case that they left in December of 2011. Maybe they left in June, and therefore that's why they're earning less. They have, lower earnings than the previous year. Right? So this is much lower than this, and maybe that's due to the fact that somebody wasn't employed in all of 2011. That's fine. But the real evidence for downwards earning trajectory comes from the fact that we find this even in the year prior to that, so 2 years prior to leaving. And that sort of holds true in almost all of these cohorts, that it's not just between the year they leave and the year before. We also see something happening the year before that as well, which again, I think is indicative of the fact that there's some sort of bad labor market employer-employee match going on. Something, there's some shocks that are going on. And these individuals, these immigrants that eventually return home or migrate abroad, are experiencing some downward earnings trajectory in multiple years that influence their decision to leave the United States. We are also able to show, and I won't show you that analysis here, but we have it in the paper because we have on the W-2s the employer identification number, the EIN, that those who end up leaving the US have multiple employers, suggesting that someone is getting fired, and if they're on a work visa, they have to find another employer relatively quickly. And and these changes are probably not by their choice, because obviously they're taking new employment at lower wages, and eventually they get to a point at which they decide that they're leaving completely. I'll show you the same result for women. So again, it seems to be a pretty empirical regularity that this is happening across both genders as well. And this is the same results that I showed for men. The three components. This is the panel data set. This is the repeated cross-section, and this is the return migrants. The only difference between men and women, let me just show you the men once more. This is the men, is at the origin. So there's always a downward trend for the return migrants, an upward trend for both the panel and repeated cross-section. But at the time of arrival, the group that's eventually going to return migrate earns significantly lower earnings than the group that ends up staying. And again, I don't know why that is, but it's actually an interesting fact. It's an interesting result. Maybe that's because I don't know. I think there's a lot of interesting hypotheses that could be tested, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But that is the origin, the origin earnings, and this is statistically significantly different from one another. I've tested it. Is quite interesting. But nevertheless, the shapes of these figures are similar to that of men. So if we look at educational attainment, and just looking at the panel data set, not the return migrants, looking at who assimilates the quickest for men ages 25 to 45, again, we have a really unusual result where immigrants with less high school degree earn more than their native-born counterparts. There are probably some interesting reasons why that is, as well as relatively small numbers. So I sort of discount this, but it's an interesting result. But I think what's most interesting is that the earnings assimilation are the highest for those with an MA or PhD, then those who have a college degree, and then again, sort of monotonically decreasing in educational attainment, as you'd kind of expect. This is men. I'll show you the same results for women next. It seems as if these results are approximately similar to what we find for men, although there's a little bit more differences in more college-educated women. And then country of birth. we see that, again, this is just for the men right now. We see that what I think is quite interesting is at the origin, who starts off with relatively large deficits and who makes the biggest gains. And Chinese immigrants to the US start off with the biggest discrepancies from native born, but make some of the largest gains with relatively few years and exceed that of their native born counterparts. The group that has a consistent and relatively no change are Mexicans. They always earn approximately 0.25 log points less than native born counterparts, and that seems to hold true over almost all years. This other group that also holds makes some upward movement are Filipinos, but then again they are sort of at a constant, persistent level of earnings below that of the native born counterparts. The group that starts above and remains above at all years are Canadians, as you see here, Canadian men. And then for women, we see somewhat similar results for Canadian women. We see a very fast overtaking of native-born women by immigrants from India, as well as those from from the Philippines, which differs from what we found previously for men. And immigrants from China have a lot more noise, women immigrants. But again, the persistent similarity of Mexican women to Mexican men in earning a persistently lower earnings than their native-born counterparts. And race, again, it sort of mirrors what we've shown. Non-Hispanic whites, again, probably mostly Canadians. We see mostly a convergence of Black, Asian, and Hispanic to native-born counterparts. So to summarize this section, the earnings assimilation, we find that there's a relatively fast assimilation, about 5 years. The return migrants, however, have this persistent across gender, across years in the US, whether they're in the US for 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 or 10, persistent downward earnings mobility trajectory. And as I said, I didn't show the results, but we have evidence that the longer the return migrants stay, meaning more than 1 year, the more likely they are to have a different employer than the year before. Earnings assimilation increases for all of these education categories, and MA and PhD individuals with an MA or PhD are quite close to their native-born counterparts by year 11. Immigrants from Canada, India, and China have higher earnings than natives in a relatively short amount of time, 2 to 5 years. And Filipinos and Mexicans have persistently lower earnings after 11 years. And non-Hispanic whites have significant earnings gains over the native-born population of the same race. Okay. So I'll just show you these last results just because I'm really excited about them. And they're related to these results, but they're a different subset. And I'll just go over them really quickly and then I'll conclude. So this analysis, what we did was we restricted analysis to everyone who arrived in the US and say they're currently in school, in graduate school in particular. We compare them to native-born who also indicate that they're currently in graduate school. So that's one group. And then we looked at immigrants who came to the US with a graduate degree in hand, either an MA or a PhD or an MBA, something more than a college degree. And we compare them to native-born who also have a graduate degree, again, in ages 25 to 45. And this is the return migration rate. So again, above here are the native-born. So this is the labor force participation rate that I've normalized to 1. You'll notice across the x-axis, we started looking at individuals in 2007. So give you some time to go through your graduate program. Again, this is the cohort that arrived in 2005. Granted, many people may take longer than 2 years. Nevertheless, we wanted to see what it looked like for this population. And what we find, which I think is kind of interesting, is that the immigrants who come with graduate degree, the red line, they have a higher probability of return migrating than immigrants who come to the US in 2005 and are currently in a graduate program. They stay in the US at a higher proportion or higher likelihood, right? By year 10, essentially, they have about 80% remain, whereas about 75% of those with graduate degrees remain. For women, the difference is almost negligible. The same amount return home, whether you come with a graduate degree or you earn your graduate degree in the US. Again, really interesting results. Lots of cool hypotheses, and hope to talk about those. And then I wanted to show you earnings assimilation. And this is for men. What we find, again, this is the panel group, the group that stays in the entire time, and this is the group that return migrates. So this is immigrant native earnings for individuals with prior graduate degrees. So again, people who came to the US with their PhD or MA or MBA before they arrived to the US, those that stay for all years have earnings assimilation. Those that leave have downward earnings trajectory, right? So very similar to the results I showed earlier for the general population. And for women, again, it sort of holds about the same. The directions are, diverging to some extent between these two populations. Okay, but here's where the cool, interesting, novel stuff comes in, is when we look at individuals who come to the US, get a graduate degree in the US, we look at the group that stays the whole time and the group that ends up leaving, they have parallel upward trends. And that is sort of, again, a new novel finding. What I think this means, and I'm open to hearing what other people's thoughts are on this, is that there's something about getting a graduate degree in the US that gives you some sort of labor market characteristics or acculturation or assimilation that makes your earnings opportunities very similar to everyone in your cohort, and that individuals who choose to return aren't sort of on a downward trajectory. They're just returning because they have other rationale. They want to work at home. They have families there. They only came to the US for the intent and purpose of ever going back, right? Getting training and or job experience in the US labor market in order to go back home, as opposed to those who come with a graduate degree already and intend to stay forever, but end up sort of in a bad employer-employee match and have a downward earnings trajectory. That's what we think is going on. But I'm happy and open to interpretation and discussion. And this is for women, just to show you that it mostly holds up, that there's this parallel upward trajectory for women who come to the US and get their graduate degree, both for the group that stays for the entire time period we're looking at, as well as the group that return migrates. So just to conclude, again, this is a relatively novel data set where we document immigrant return migration as well as their earnings assimilation across these different initial characteristics. And I think the findings that we're most excited about are the fact that there's a downward earnings trajectory for immigrants that return migrate, suggesting that there's something about hard luck or bad experiences in the labor market that are an important determinant of return migration. And I think I'll end there and open it up for questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was great. So we have one waiting question, but I will also let folks know this is the time to raise your hand virtually, and I'll put you in the queue to unmute you and ask questions. So the existing question, or the earlier question, had to do with folks who are immigrants who have left, and whether you know more about their family connections or household structure, not just in terms of marriage, but are they married to native? Do they have family residing in the US? And if that explains who might be leaving versus staying.
The answer is we do have that information, and we have only utilized it insofar as we know whether or not they're currently married. We've only used, as I said, marital status. I think the question that you're asking is whether or not we can identify whether the spouse is U.S. citizen or native born. And the answer is yes, we can do that, and we haven't done that. So I think that would be another extension, yeah, or another check on this. Yeah, thanks.
One more question that was typed in. So Eduardo says, none of the graphs showed confidence intervals. Should we expect the differences to remain when confidence intervals are added, or would we have several intervals overlapping? In other words, how precise are your estimates?
Yeah, a great question. And we didn't put it in because there's so many crazy lines to begin with. But the answer is most of those differences persist. Especially the ones that are diverging, they definitely persist. And what was I going to say? In terms of the earnings, the differences between the panel and the repeated cross-section earnings, those are always very close to one another. And I think we mentioned in the paper that those aren't statistically significant from one another. And in the paper, we discuss a bit more about the origin points with regard to, starting earnings. I think, and maybe with regard to the return migration, those are just counts. So those aren't actually, those wouldn't have confidence intervals. The decrease in proportion of the immigrant cohort. So those are, they're actual numbers. There's no, we wouldn't have, anyway. So yes, for the earnings, most of the differences persist as they diverge for those two groups.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask a question of my own.
Sure.
And actually I have two. The first is, what do you think the policy implications are of this work? Or what does it suggest about various policies related to immigration, as interesting as they are in our country at this time? And then second, what do you see as an important extension of this work? Where are you taking it in the future?
So the policy implication, I think, is that immigrants are, especially the long-term stayers, are much more resilient and productive than we were led to believe. And we were led to believe that based on incomplete, inaccurate data. So a lot of, as I said, sort of alluded to at the beginning, is that, a lot of the concern about immigration is that we get individuals who aren't earning their keep. And so, at least in the formal labor force, documented slice of the world, which is all that you can see in most data, unfortunately, that's not the case. So, there's been attacks on immigration, obviously at the undocumented side, but also the documented side recently. So at least, I can't say too much about the undocumented side, unfortunately, because the data don't illuminate that part, not this data anyway. But at least, even where there's, there's political sort of, distaste for even documented immigration. Here's some evidence that immigrants get to the level of native born relatively quickly. So even if there is some kind of a drag, that's happens fairly, it doesn't last for very long. The other is that the individuals that don't get a good match, are rational thinkers, are rational, they behave rationally. And as they see their earnings, diminishing over time because they're not the right fit, it's not the right, labor market for them, they make rational decisions. And at some point, if things don't turn up, they end up leaving. So this sort of, idea that people come and they just are unproductive, it just no evidence for that. And so that, I think, again, is sort of important for when we consider policy, that people are mostly rational and are making it. So I think that's, I don't know that it affect any policymakers. I don't know that research, necessarily. Nevertheless, there's at least here's some evidence for that. And where does this go in the future? As I said, we're finishing up this first part of the paper, and we're trying to finish up the second one, which is the graduate student one, which I think is very unique and interesting, and trying to figure out what it is about the graduate school experience that creates is it the socialization, is it the expectations that create the upward trajectory for even both groups? And that is kind of interesting and unique, especially coming from university professors, right? who are involved in this. So
that's great. I'm going to see if there are any more raised hands. And I just want to thank everyone for listening. We had a good crowd. And I'm just delighted we pulled it off without too many technical hitches. So thank you very, very much. Thank you also for visiting with the graduate students earlier today.
Yes, that was
really
fantastic.
Appreciated hearing about your work.
Well, thanks for having me, everyone, and hope to meet a bunch of you in real life at some point in the future.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.